All right. Yes, it is. All right, well, good afternoon. It is afternoon right now, so we've had an excellent morning. And actually, if those of you who are here for hearing, in particular, the Norwegian Defense Minister, I think that this panel is just going to be a perfect follow-on, because part of her own remarks, she certainly focused in on the importance of the elements of a strategy. And that is, in fact, as you know, the title of our session. We are going to be focusing on elements of a new transatlantic strategy. I'm Paula Dobriansky, and I'm on the board of the Atlantic Council, and we have a very prestigious and very engaging panel. We will be hearing from Frank Kramer, who is a distinguished senior fellow here at the Scowcroft Center on International Security. He's also a member of the board and the member of the strategy group. And the other thing I'm going to highlight about you is also the fact that you did serve as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs for President Clinton. You were with Secretary Perry, and you were also with Secretary Cohen. So thank you. And then we will be hearing from Dr. Lilia Shesova. She is a non-resident senior fellow at the Center in the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institution. I think many of you know her and her writings. She's a prolific writer. She has, in fact, co-authored and authored over 20 books. And she also was previously at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace as a senior associate there and chair of the Russia Domestic Program. A very prolific writer about Russia, which we're going to hear in this mix. And then, of course, Damon Wilson, who's the Executive Vice President here of Programs and Strategy at the Atlantic Council. All of you also certainly know him. He served as the Special Assistant to the President and also Senior Director for European Affairs at the National Security Council. He had 2 stints. He was Senior Director, and he also was, before that, Director for Central Eastern Europe and North European Affairs. And I also want to mention that he served as a Senior Advisor to Lord Robertson when he was at NATO. So let's go to a very first question, just for all of you to really look at. This question of, does the Atlantic community or transatlantic community, does it need a strategy? Is it lacking a strategy? Frank.
Sure. I think the answer is, well, it certainly needs a strategy, and I think it's fair to say right now that it has elements of a strategy, but it's lacking an overall strategy. And the reason I would say that is that from what you've heard, for example, from the Norwegian Defense Minister and others, we're facing new problems, and it takes time to develop a strategy. I've talked about in the past about the problems, what I've called the geopolitics of resentment. And it's around the world. For example, in China, they specifically forbid the teaching of Western values. In the Middle East, you've got violent extremism. Obviously in Russia, certainly since President Putin, 2007, I believe, Munich speech, rejecting the West. So we've suddenly had to move from that more positive post-Cold War scenario of the 90s into a much more complicated time, and it's not just the 9/11 sets of issues, it's throughout the world. It's not a surprise that it takes time to develop a strategy, but that really is what we need to do. And I think the first place to do it, and that's what this meeting is really all about, is to get the closest allies together, that is the transatlantic allies, to figure out what we can do. That's across the board. That's not just NATO. It's at the first level, I think, so to speak, to reassert what I would call the liberal international order, the values that we're in favor of. There's an economic element, TTIP, there's an information element, and then there's a security/military element. I think all those needs to be put together.
And we're going to come back to NATO specifically with you in a minute, but I think you've laid out the broad elements of certainly what is needed in stepping back and looking at what we're lacking or what hasn't been well articulated. Lilia, what about you, your view on this? Are we lacking a grand strategy?
Paula, you apparently know already my answer. Well, it would be presumptions on the part of a Russian sitting here at the Atlantic Council to make any comments on NATO, especially when you know the mainstream view of the Kremlin on the NATO strategy. NATO strategy has to be bury yourself as soon as possible. But I would say, as a Russian liberal, I would say, NATO has no strategy in my view. NATO, as the institution, maybe the most coherent institution of the West, has to have a strategy that will erase any temptation for reckless forces and reckless powers to test where the red line is. Are you satisfied with my answer?
It is your answer. Damon, what about from where you're sitting?
Thanks, Paula. I think we are lacking of a strategy right now. I think, as Frank said, that there are elements in play, but we've sort of have bounced around from perhaps too hot. The American people and our allies believe we may have gone too far in the last administration, and we're not there in this administration, and we're grappling around right now. I think if you look at the alliance itself, this is a sort of a call, and you heard the minister, the Norwegian minister, it's almost a call to action. This is actually the time to take this on, because we have had clarity in the past. We've gone through very clear strategies with this alliance that began as one based on deterrence of the Soviet threat and containment, that moved into a real outreach posture of helping to turn adversaries into allies through engagement and enlargement, that became a very operational alliance in a third chapter, engaged in operations first in the Balkans and then further afield. And now what? It's very unclear. And what we've seen happen in the wake of the shock of what happened in Crimea to most of our political leaders and play out of the last Wales summit was the beginnings of recoiling and saying back to the core, back to deterrence, back to defense is our strategy. That's insufficient. The underlying problems we have right now, which I think have to be addressed as we go forward to Wales, hit at what Frank was saying. NATO itself is the expression of a grand strategy. After the devastation of World War II, we set out to build an international liberal democratic order in which our societies could be prosperous and secure based on security arrangements, economic arrangements, and all premised on these values that Frank referred to that underpin that. And right now, we've backed away from that. We actually are not even defenders of that international liberal order we built. And I think the core of a strategy, which NATO will be embedded in and part of, is going back to how we actually stand by the originating values that brought us together in the first place, to lay out a durable path forward that, yes, deters, protects our own at home, as the minister laid out very clearly, but also has an offense, and offense not in a militaristic way, but in an advancing of those values, because ultimately that's the grand strategy for security and prosperity, which was what this alliance was supposed to be about, delivering peace globally.
All right. Frank, let's come back to you. In fact, I do want to feature here, Frank is the co-author of the Atlantic Council's publication. If those of you who haven't seen it, it is outside, NATO's New Strategy, Stability Generation. If I may quote, you have, NATO must add resilience as a core task to its existing tasks of collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. Drill deeper on this about what is the recommendation of this product, specifically what needs to be done here in terms of NATO.
Sure, thank you, Paula. As Damon said, this is a NATO strategy, so one of the points in the report is that a NATO strategy really only works if it's built into an overall transatlantic strategy, where Paula started us. But within that concept, one of the things we also say is that even in the security arena, things have changed. There's a sentence in here to the effect, when war changes, so must defenses. And one of the things that we've looked at, and I believe those of you who were here earlier this morning heard Fabrice say this, is that it's not that collective defense is not critical, because it is. It's not that crisis management may not be important, because it may be. And it's not that cooperative security is not important, because that's also important. Those are the three tasks that NATO has in its strategic concept. But our recommendation in this report is that NATO really has to add a fourth task. We called it resilience. And that has multiple elements to it, and I'll come to it. We also think that collective defense needs to be increased. We also think that crisis management needs to be increased. But if we don't do resilience, then we're going to find that the alliance is not providing the security that it needs. And the other element of that is that we need new institutions, because one thing is for sure, resilience is not something that NATO can do alone. We need to have the civil authorities engaged, and remarkably enough, we need to have private sector entities engaged. That's perfectly obvious, for example, in the cyber arena. It's true also in other arenas. So we had a series of recommendations, both to build on Wales, especially with respect to collective defense and hybrid conflict, to create some structural changes in NATO, and to have a strategy that works not only with the military and the intelligence community alike, but also with civil institutions and with the private sector. We agree with what you've heard, and I suspect all of you have thought yourselves, that there really are several theaters, and we actually identified three rather than just the sort of the two, the East and the South. One is the East, that's for sure, that's the Russia problem. The second is the South, writ broad. But the third is the vulnerability of NATO internally to attacks like cyber attacks, as we've seen here in the United States, not just over in Europe, energy type problems, information type problems, and the like. So we think all three need to be dealt with. With respect to Russia and the East, we think NATO agreed at Wales to have a framework nation approach. We think that needs to be expanded. We think that some of the things, there needs to be, I prefer permanent presence. Some people like continuously persistent. I can live with that. But a lot more in the East. Pre-positioning, reception facilities, logistics, infrastructure. Additionally, and you heard the Norwegian minister talk about this, I think that NATO needs to develop what I call the maritime framework for the Baltics and also for the High North. So that would add to the three land-based frameworks that we've had. In the East, I think it would be good to have a multinational, at least a battalion, including European forces, because it can't just be American forces. I think it'd be invaluable if the North Atlantic Council would authorize a combination of the Secretary General and the SACEUR to be able to actually move forces under certain specified conditions at the request of an affected nation. And I certainly would love to see Sweden and Finland join the alliance. Until then, and unless and until then, I think we should work with them as closely as possible. In the Mediterranean, or if you will, in the South, the tricky part here is that unlike the East, where NATO has certainly either is in the lead or has a leading role, in the South, it's really nations in the lead. You can see this in the coalition that's operating in Syria and Iraq. You can see that as to what's going on with a lot of other aspects. And so for now, I think NATO needs to say to itself, okay, just like I did in the counter-piracy operations off Somalia, I'm going to play a role, but I have to play it in a larger context. Italy's supposed to be leading a framework nation approach with respect to stabilization and reconstruction, with respect to humanitarian activities, with respect to counterinsurgency. I think that needs to be plussed up a great deal with respect to NATO. Turkey, as was mentioned by some of the speakers earlier, needs a lot of support. NATO had put in air defenses. We need to do a lot more things. The Turks have a lot of problems. They are not always the easiest allies in the world to work with, but they are terrific allies, and I think we need to do more. We need to expand our partnerships with Jordan, the Gulf states, and Egypt. And if and when Montenegro is deemed to have met the criteria, I think it would be invaluable to have them join. This should not be the end of NATO enlargement, and especially for the South if we complete it. I mentioned resilience. This would take different kinds of things. We think it would be useful to have, we made up a name, it doesn't make any difference what you call it, but NATO teams. There are NATO teams now, civil military teams, just small size that focus on cyber. We think starting off with something similar, focusing on resilience, both hybrid warfare, it was already mentioned, you have information, you have police, you have indications and warning. Some nations can handle this on their own, but some nations need a lot of help. And so if we had these resilience support teams, it would be important. They won't work unless they're counterpart national teams. So you have to have both the NATO group and the national group And then if you can get the European Union to work with NATO, that would be terrific. But I don't think you can have only the European Union doing it. I think you have to have the national part and the NATO part and the European Union. And then you need to have a group that brings in the relevant civil authorities and private sector. You cannot do cyber without the private sector. It will not work. But it can work. Many of these companies are very willing to do kinds of things, notwithstanding all the sets of issues about privacy and Mr. Snowden and the like. So we have to go forward. Finally, I think publics need to know more. So I've suggested that we create an open source center for NATO, focusing first of all on cyber threats, on violent extremism, and potentially also on Russia. We need to make sure that there's the adequate investment that's been mentioned. There have to be adequate European capabilities. The minister was as clear as she could be. I couldn't support her more. And then lastly, and I think the Libya experience demonstrates this, if you don't have a civil counterpart to a military operation, you're likely to fail. So whenever NATO is going to undertake a military operation, there ought to be a civilian counterpart. It could be ad hoc. It could be like a contact group, or it could be the European Union and the U.S. civil authorities, but it needs to be done together. So it's a long report. I could obviously go on forever, but let me stop there.
No, but that's a very good overview, and I'm going to go to Damon later, but to talk about how to actually implement that, because that's a rather comprehensive list, and the question is, how does one get from here to there in actually advancing it? But let's discuss Russia a bit. Lilia, let's come back to you on this question about the whole issue about Russia's own view of NATO. As you know, actually, at the time with the illegal annexation of Crimea and no less the aggression into Ukraine, there had been many articles written by different people about why Russia undertook this action. And one of the rationales cited was because of NATO expansion. Talk about, does NATO have, what kind of meaning does NATO have for Russia in this case? And what do you perceive as Russia's strategy toward NATO?
Paula, the more I'm thinking about NATO in the Russian context, by the way, it's very sobering to hear what you say about Russia. Maybe I will change my views about my country. Well, what I'm hearing about NATO in the Russian context only persuades me that, the Kremlin, firstly, doesn't think that NATO is a really serious threat. Secondly, it's very interesting to use the anti-NATO rhetoric while there were all signs that NATO had been fast asleep and lost its drive, stamina, and apparently, became such an obsolete institution like many other institutions, including the EU and Brussels. And I can believe that even, the Russian propaganda people and Putin himself, together with our foreign affairs minister, they chuckle every time when they use NATO expansion as the pretext, for Russia's dealing with Ukraine. So we have apparently to understand that these guys have a sense of humor. Well, what about the real stuff? If we just unwrap, all this imitation, fake stuff that so many people in the West are ready to believe. When I was listening to a very respectable guy, Senator Hagel, when he said that Russia definitely needs a place in Syria, I thought to myself, do we, with Andrei Leonov, believe that Russia needs to be in Syria, having all these problems? So apparently he's also persuaded by Russians that somehow NATO or the West didn't give Russia an adequate place, okay? And especially 10 years after NATO expansion. Anyway, a couple of points, if I may.
Please.
I am very naive about NATO, so I'm sorry, I don't know and don't understand these military angles. But there is one absolutely clear message that the Russian development now sends to the West. And apparently we have to be grateful to President Putin for kicking over the the global chessboard, because otherwise such discussions would have been impossible. So in effect, he gave a kind of a waking call. The problem is, and for me, and I'm deliberating on that, whether this call was serious enough for the West and for the Western political and expert community. Well, judging by some of the comments, during the morning session, it wasn't serious. It wasn't really serious enough. So several things. Firstly, we need to understand that the Russian political system is now looking for a new way of survival. And Putin has adopted this new doctrine of survival, shifting Russia into the war paradigm. So now the military patriotic legitimacy is the key argument, the key means to consolidate the society and justify reproduction of the system. And I'm very much afraid that Russia cannot get out, of the war paradigm and military patriotic legitimacy back into the peace mode. But on the other hand, we see a conundrum. Well, this is conundrum that you understand, and once we discuss it with you, conundrum is the following. While the system cannot reproduce itself without a war, there are no means in the budget to continue militarization. And ironical, and this is irony, that the elite, the elite stupid, the elite being personally integrated, major part of the Russian elite, being personally integrated into Londongrad and all other perfect and nice places, is not ready to turn Russia into North Korea. They're ready to play within the West, Shredderization, Londongrad, etc., and insulate Russia from the West. And I'm not sure that the society is ready to continue to live, in this kind of zombie-like state, demoralized by military propaganda and enemy search, because only, can you imagine, 25% of the Russian population, you can trust the polls. You cannot trust the polls. Only 25%, still believe these military patriotic slogans. And only 13% of respondents of Russians now, they're ready to sacrifice for Ukraine, for Syria, for anything else. So Russians do not want any kind of war. They do not want any kind of confrontation with you. So this is a conundrum. On the one hand, the system cannot survive without military thrust. On the other hand, the system and the country are not ready for this kind of the war and confrontation with NATO, with Europe, with whatever world. But there are a couple of more points. I'm kicking over, my list of arguments, simply responding and commenting what I've heard here. One point on the Western failure, on the Western political failure, on the Western expert failure. Here, the Norwegian defense minister several times mentioned somehow, and senator too, somehow the West and we in NATO have been, caught unawares. Come on, why? Why the Western political community and experts, why you always are caught unawares? You were not prepared in 1991 for collapse of the Soviet Union. In 2010, during the Lisbon summit, you endorsed the strategy for partnership with Russia, when Putin already had warned you in Munich, folks, I'm going to whack you down. You believed in Medvedev when, it was absolutely certain that Medvedev is interlude and simply a fig leaf for Putin. And, you were absolutely unprepared for the Crimea annexation, Anschluss, and the Russian war with Ukraine, when everything already pointed in this direction after the war with Georgia. So what's the problem? Is it, our difference in political mentality? Because Putin had been all the way, he had been candid. He had been alerting you. So what's the problem? And what's the guarantee that you're not going to fail again? Second observation, also connected to our previous session, is observation regarding the issue of security. Because, well, I'm not so sure that you need, all this absolutely perfect fleet of submarines and all these long discussions of maritime whatever, and deployment of the rapid forces in Estonia, etc. There is a much more serious challenge. And this challenge is the Kremlin broad understanding of the security agenda that includes energy war, gas war, trade war, cooptation of the different regimes, forces, and countries. Look at Hungary, look at Czech Republic, look at some other forces in Europe. Moreover, you know, it's not necessary for Russia, for the Kremlin to start invasion of Estonia or Lithuania. Well, it's for the time being, they're pretty happy with the successful information war. So, well, the new strategy of containment the West inside of the Western society. One more, maybe one of the last points, wobbliness of the West. Paula, you started this conversation whether NATO has strategy or not, or no strategy. But it seems to me, without the West, the Western community, without wobbliness, double standards, without your readiness for broad Shredinization, without US retrenching, or how Obama is leading from behind or from what spot? From behind, okay? With paralysis of the Brussels bureaucracy, Russian Trojan horses in Europe, hardly Putin would have ever risked this absolutely dangerous for Russia project with Crimea and Ukraine, because nearly majority of the Russian elite was against that. But he risked it because his assumption was the West will stomach it, Germany will agree, and the oil price will be the same. And the final point is, I'm very much afraid that the challenges and threats that we are discussing here, and not only here but in other capitals, are minor, teeny tiny, threats that we are going to face in the nearest decade, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now, because the major threat and the major challenge is before us. And this challenge is the obsolete Russian system, the state system, cannot be sustainable within this geographical format, within this paradigm of survival. And sooner or later, the system will start to unravel, because society does not want to live within it. Well, of course, it has a lot of patience. It is demoralized, but, when people are asking Russia what you would like to have in Russia, great power, they say, yes, Russia has to be a great power. But what kind of great power? And 65% say we would like to live a normal life. It's not about military annexation of any other country. So this is unsustainable. So the moment is approaching, and maybe, the moment is approaching sooner than we hope and think, that the Russian zombie petro-state half-frozen empire will start to unravel, and will have the task to build a nation state. It's a kind of looking into the black hole. Russian nationalism, Russian national identity. We don't know how to deal with it yet, but this is the challenge that will have tremendous repercussions in the security field, in the defense area, in the foreign policy area. Are you prepared for that, thinking only about maritime problems and Kaliningrad? It's much broader. It's much more bloody, predatory, exciting. And of course, I would support the comment and the slogan and the demand of the previous panels. The West needs leadership. I'm thinking not only about the US leadership. I'm thinking about restoration of political leadership in the West as a whole, and coming to the fore of the leaders who will understand the strategic challenges, who will understand the normative dimension, who will understand, that we are apparently entering absolutely new epoch, and leadership that will be ready to erase any kind of temptation or incentive for other powers. Just look at illiberal China, look at Iran, not only Russia, for illiberal powers and illiberal forces in reckless states to test where the red line is, because, the illiberal states continue to look for the red lines, and they don't see the red lines.
Lilia, you and Frank have underscored, I think, in your comments that this is not only about a discussion about a strategy toward NATO. Why I asked the first question is it's more holistic, and I think both of you in different ways certainly have underscored that crucial point. Damon, let's come back to the points that Frank put out in the report. I mean, one of the core questions really is how implementable is it? There is the issue of where we are in the transatlantic relationship. Do we all have the same view of what the challenges are from the East and from Putin and from Russia? How can we advance this agenda? What are the kinds of concrete steps that one can take in this? And also, doesn't the moral narrative have an important place in this? We heard the defense minister talk about the importance of credibility, the importance of unity. That was a very recurring theme in her remarks.
Thank you, Paula. Let me try to connect both Frank and Lilia's comments here. And first of all, kudos to Frank, who has really worked to lay out one of the most thoughtful stabs that I've seen at trying to articulate a real strategy for the alliance as it grapples right now. But I want to start with Lilia and come back to that, because I always respect and enjoy listening to the straightforward, direct talk that we hear from Lilia, knowing that how much conviction and courage it takes for a Russian to stand here and do that. But I think it hits at something important to remember, that there has been a change because we had a strategy that incorporated what we were doing with NATO and what we were doing with Russia. This vision, actually beginning with Gorbachev, Common European Home, George Herbert Walker Bush, Europe whole, free, and at peace, which really was premised on an actual vision that was led by three strategies of attaining the strategic partnership, a fundamentally different relationship with Russia first, that then unlocked the process of engagement, outreach to adversaries, that started enlargement, and that provided the umbrella for a profoundly deepening of the European integration project. And that worked pretty well for 25 years. And it's broken down. And it's broken down because I actually agree with Lilia. It's broken down not for external reasons, but for internal reasons, because our counterpart evolved into a more authoritarian, kleptocratic regime. And so we've seen Putin replace the social contract that he had of rising living standards, stay out of politics, as a source of legitimacy in the absence of democratic expression of that, to now, as Lilia has so eloquently articulated, putting the country on a war footing internally to consolidate its hold on power, while having confidence because of what you've called the wobbliness of the West, that you can erode and exploit our own weaknesses and divisions so that we are sapped of the political will and we don't invest in the capability to change that game. And so part of the strategy today, and I'll come back to the NATO piece to this, but we shouldn't be sending a lifeline to that approach. We should challenge and see if he spins his economy into destruction or backs down. But if you bring this back to Frank's piece and how do you relate these, Frank's responded with his piece because if you look at NATO actually has a strategy written down and recognizes that that strategy is out of date. That strategy was premised on some very clear assumptions, that the Euro-Atlantic community was at peace, and now we have essentially an interstate war in Europe, that Russia was a strategic partner, and now Russia's positioning itself as more of an adversary. And if you read the strategic concept, that the Middle East actually played a relatively insignificant minor role, and now we see that the turmoil in the region has a direct impact on Europe's security. And finally, a strategy that actually I don't think did anticipate the future in terms of the rapid change of technology, the spread of what that means in terms of adversaries being able to close the gap with the allies, as well as the empowerment of more adversaries. And so that brings us back to the strategy we need and where Frank has begun to frame that conversation. And the context is NATO fits into it. It's a broader strategy because what we right now have is a Europe, the core of the alliance, that is facing these historic challenges from the east, from Russia, a historic challenge from the south as we watch what plays out right now. But probably the most disturbing one is what you've both referred to, this internal one of what Europe is, what our community is, and the values that underpin it, that has led to a crisis of confidence and this erosion of solidarity. And this is, to put it in action, therefore, it doesn't work for us to let Europe come up with something and play the supporting role. I think the stakes are too high, the United States has to be catalytic in this process of forging what is going to be a broader strategy that will inform the NATO strategy. And I think that's what's on the table right now, where we have the down payment. We have the whole work stream that began in the wake of Crimea, the Wales Summit, that begins the protect our own, begins the restorations of a strong deterrent strategy. It's needed, it takes time, Warsaw needs to deliver on that, and I think Frank outlines ways to move that forward, including not being wishy-washy about what we have to do, but we have to recognize we have to move the alliance east, including, I would say, permanent stationing of forces until President Putin changes the sense of posture that we don't worry about that. But we are creating inadvertent consequences because it's an inadequate strategy. We run the risk in the East of actually creating a new, I've heard our colleagues in the region refer to it as an Article 5 Iron Curtain, and that we've made it clear who's in and who's out. We're back to protecting our own. And I think that's, and it was very inadequate in terms of addressing the challenges towards the south, as we've seen essentially unaddressed problems festering in Syria, Iraq, Libya, leading to the crisis in Europe we have today. So that means that the task that the Allied leaders have going forward to Wales is a strategy that actually unites them, that brings them together. How do you integrate East and South, short-term and long-term, into something that's coherent around which you unify the alliance? In the East, that means you've got to be able to deal with Russia in the short-term, hybrid. In the South, it means the instability of these states, crumbling of nation states in terms of sources of terrorism and migration. But it also means over the long term, the fundamental change of global power structure, the rise of Asia-Pacific and technological changes. And I think it has to be a strategy that therefore then begins to communicate clearly to the adversaries and potential adversaries while aligning the allies into how they fit into it and how they contribute to it and how it actually is a source of solidarity. And this is where I think the minister began to hit on it, because I think it is this deterrence role, the capability to invest and develop these capabilities to move east, and not just deter, but to show that you can defeat an adversary. We're sometimes worried of saying that. But at the same time, recognizing and not abandoning. What I felt Wales did was abandon where we had come in alliance strategy, that we understood that we had to go to where threats might originate if we're going to protect our security. It's not sufficient just to protect our own. And I think we have to now combine the emphasis on deterrence with that projection. And that's the projection of going back and understanding that we have to advance this international liberal order in which we're invested, beginning closer to home. It's why things like integrating the Western Balkans and Europe's East matter, avoiding a gray zone of instability in the region, and keeping open the prospect of a different relationship with Russia. It puts a real emphasis on the South. And so bringing together a NATO strategy that focuses on capacity building, defense capacity building, and some of the resilient strategies that Frank talked about, not just for the allies, but for key partners in the East, Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, but also in the South, key partners in the South, and stays connected to where we were beginning to go with the alliance and thinking about its global partnership strategy, keeping the alliance at the heart of what is a broader strategy that the United States is helping to develop on security, prosperity, and the values base of linking what we have globally to anchor this international liberal order.
I have another question for them, but I want to come to all of you so we have engagement here. So be thinking of your questions. I want to pick up on this point that also comes out in each of your comments, and that is, and you, I think, hit it most directly, Lilia, and that is, all right, we need to have unity. There's a challenge, and we've had history in terms of the engagement of Russia in the context of NATO. The question is where we are now. How do you engage Russia in this? Are there certain issues which were being discussed earlier, in fact, by former Secretary of Defense Hagel, where he was stating that there are some issues where Russia has to be engaged? Let's go and hear your views. Let's begin backwards. Damon, with you, and then let's come down, and then we're going to go to the audience.
So this has been the issue. And what's the deal with Russia? How do you bring stability to Europe and Europe's east, and how do you work with Russia? The problem right now is we're trying to seek a deal when we haven't actually exerted sufficient pressure to bring our interests together where there is a feasible deal. The terms of the deal right now essentially mean if the United States is going to back up Europe and the crisis in the East, it means we're going to have to sacrifice some fundamental principles and sacrifice some of the partners in the East. I don't think that's the engagement, that's the deal we want. I think to get to a stage where we actually can come to some greater stability, the heat has to go up, and that has to be felt in Moscow. So it has to be not the uncertainty about how we're handling the economic side or the sanctions, but clarity and continuing that, doubling down on that. It has to be clear that we're not worried about provoking Russia by doing what's normal, by being at strength in the high north or standing by Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova's ability to be sovereign countries. But we actually develop a very clear deterrent strategy, which helps build the allies in the East, helps build the deterrent capability of Sweden, Finland, and yes, helps build those capabilities in the Eastern partners in a way that as we work on energy, on trade, on the political issues, that it becomes quite clear that the current pathway that President Putin has put his country on is one that he can't sustain financially, afford politically, to come back to an ability to be able to engage Putin more constructively. Right now, Putin's engagement with us is meant to be disruptive. His engagement on these issues, whether it be Syria or whatever, is not about Syria. It is about disrupting our interests and disrupting the United States. And so I think we haven't set the terms of the table right to actually be able to get out and achieve our interest in engaging Putin yet, because he hasn't felt enough pressure.
Okay, Lillian.
I would agree with Damon. He put it much tougher than I would apparently have done. I will add one footnote to what you have said. It seems to me that, firstly, if we are dealing with strategic interests and outlooks and agendas, they are irreconcilable between the Russian system and the West. At the moment, no possibility to bridge the gap. But at the same time, if we go down a bit lower to the tactical interests, Afghanistan still, narco traffic, even, nukes, okay? Well, even Iran,
was another one mentioned.
energy security, etc. So tactically, there are points of coincidence and there are points for trade-offs. The problem is that the Kremlin has been much more astute, apparently, much more skillful in putting the common agenda into the transactional area. For every tactical common interest, Afghanistan, etc., transit rule, the Kremlin will be asking a trade-off, a bargain, okay, reciprocity. We helped you with Iran, Mr. Obama, aren't we? So you have to give us reciprocity, whether it's Ukraine or something else. So how you folks are going to deal with reciprocity issue? That's the problem. Because so far, any dual track policy, Damon, I hope that you will agree me and support me, dual track, firstly, deterring each other and then cooperating, it was used much more skillfully by the Kremlin. Is it the problem of Kremlin's skillful tactical toolkit, or maybe lack of your principles? I still don't know.
Okay, Frank.
I think we ought to start by saying to ourselves, what kind of Russia do we want? And then be clear that we don't like the kind we have.
But we've got it.
We've got it. No, I understand that. But we need to say we would like to see Russia change internally. The Russians will have to do that themselves. We're not going to do it. But that was actually our position in the Cold War, and we ought to stand fast with it with respect to, again, I call it the liberal world order, but, and we ought to be clear about that. The second point we ought to have clear is that Russia, although it has some strengths, is really only one country among many, and it's not nearly as powerful as the United States, period, but certainly not nearly as powerful as the United States and our transatlantic allies combined. So it's fine to have Russia as part of a coalition, but it's not a one-to-one relationship, no matter how much they want it. The third point is that there's some things that we need to reduce vulnerabilities on. We're foolish to let ourselves be at the, maybe mercy is not quite the right word, but in any event, with the Russians having their thumb on the scales. So that's certainly true with energy. The Europeans have been better on this recently, but we need to be a lot better. It's certainly true with cyber. It's, for most people, that's a black box, but we need to do a lot more in that arena. It's certainly true with information. RT, as many of you know, is a very effective tool. We need to be thinking about how to deal with those kinds of issues. And we need to say that when sometimes I have enormous admiration, I must say, for Chancellor Merkel, and I always hesitate to disagree with her, but I think sometimes military is part of the solution. You can't just say, as she sometimes has said, there's no military solution. Well, I don't think that's always right. And I think with respect to Russia, and particularly with respect to Ukraine, that there's a military element. This council, I was not part of the group, but this council put out a report recommending providing weaponry and the like to the Ukraine government. I don't think you actually provide weapons without providing a much broader help on Ministry of Defense, institution building, how do you actually do weapons, training, et cetera, et cetera. But in broad terms, I think we need to just step up, and we need to confront sometimes and take the risks of confronting. So for me, I quite agree with Lilia that there are, if you want to call them tactical or specific things, maybe they're not, they're not minor. Counterterrorism, which I've heard Paula say. Yeah. We have some overlapping interest, and we ought to deal with those. And we ought to say, okay, that's exactly what we're going to do. We don't have to say that there's a moral equivalency, and we don't have to say we're not going to block them and try to, set the circumstances so they change themselves. And we don't have to say that they're an equal partner in all the activities that we do, although they can be part of a useful coalition.
All right. Let's go to you. Questions, comments. Let's go right here. If you have the mic, and if you would introduce yourself, your name and your affiliation, please. Right here in front. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you for being here. My name is Satine. I'm from the University of Utah. I'm currently an intern with the U.S. House of Representatives. My question is a complicated one, and I'm going to struggle to ask it. So it's regarding the Iran deal. So I have two parts to my question. One, what do you think is the role of Russia? What do you think the role of Russia is going to be in the future? I know this obviously has a lot of moving parts to it. And then the second part is, do you think that Iran is looked as a potential for an ally for the United States in a very complicated way when it comes to ISIL? ISIS is a common enemy between the United States and Iran. And do you think that while we can't advertise it on the books, that's what we're trying to do, are we trying to buy out an ally in the Middle East?
Okay, just to make sure everybody heard, and I think, Lilia, it's in a way for you, the question was, first, what we can expect from Russia relative to the Iran nuclear deal. And I think this fits in this whole question of strategy and what our strategy is, not only in area, but also out of area. And then you also had asked the question specifically about the collaboration, particularly in the counterterrorism area, and she focused on ISIL. And should we be collaborating with the Russians in, vis-a-vis ISIL? Maybe before you answer that, let's get one more question, if we could. Yes, we got one right up here. Sorry, the mic's there. And if you'll introduce yourself, and we'll take yours.
My name is Bob Beecroft with the State Department Office of the Inspector General. Very quick add-on, among the things that has not been mentioned in terms of U.S.-Russian cooperation now is space. We're still hitching rides on Russian rockets to get to the space station, which is co-manned by Americans and Russians. How does that fit in?
And nuclear waste, too.
Okay. Well,
Yeah.
let's take a moment on these. Lilia, do you want to?
Very briefly. Of course, I'm not an expert in the area, and only a person that knows Iranian-Russian relationship would respond to you. But my naive and maybe humble view on that is the following. Moscow, a country to anticipations of many in Moscow, supported the Iranian deal. But supported Iranian deal apparently having some kind of hope for reciprocity from Obama. And Putin, by the way, laid out this hope for reciprocity. The next day, the Iranian deal was signed. So we anticipate from the United States some, soft position on other issues. And secondly, it seems to me that Moscow has done a lot to soften the pill for Iranians. in the area of arms sales and many other issues, despite of the fact that there is a kind of very strange and maybe, dangerous threat and challenge for Russia if Iran goes into the oil, into the area of oil trade, what it would mean for the oil price for Russia. That's really a very serious thing.
Okay, any other comments on that, or we'll move on? Any comments on space? Nope, okay, let's move on. We have right here this, and we'll take, I think yours. We're gonna get two questions, yes, and we're gonna go to the back.
And Andrei Larian of Gate Institute. Two questions. One to Mr.
I
Kramer.
apologize, who did you say you are?
Andrei Larian of Gate Institute.
Thank you.
Okay. Sure, you mentioned that you would consider that Russia should take care of itself and just would do domestic work. Would you expect the same result from Germans in 1939 and 1940 without help of Americans? Would you expect the same from Italians in the same year, or from Japanese in the same year? What results would be of these expectations? And may I ask, Lily, you, would you share your views about thinking in Kremlin from expectations of meeting between Mr. Obama and Mr. Putin next week?
The last part.
The question was about whether they, in the
how
potential
Kremlin
meeting.
would consider this expected meeting between Mr. Obama and Mr. Putin, and these comments of Mrs. Merkel, who has been mentioned when she said that, okay, she's looking forward for cooperating with Mr. Assad, and so on.
Okay, and let's give the mic to the gentleman over here. We're going to get two questions. Oh, you got one.
Yeah,
All right.
hi, Michael Sveda from the Embassy of the Czech Republic. I got a question for Frank. I quickly went through your paper, and you recommend there, among others, to encourage Finland and Sweden to join NATO, to offer membership to Montenegro. But I wonder why you don't mention Georgia at all, when Georgia was the only out of these, four countries that has been promised the membership in 2008. Currently, they are the best prepared nation out of the four candidate nations. Why do you don't recommend, membership of Georgia? And it seems to me if we keep Georgia out of the membership track, we send a clear signal to Mr. Putin: if you don't want any of your neighbors joining NATO, please attack it, and then it's out of the membership track. I don't think that the signal would be good to send to Mr. Putin.
Your point.
Thanks.
Let's get his answer. Frank, we're going to work backwards. We're going to go here first, then to yours. The question just about Georgia.
Sure. So there are two ways to answer that. The first is that one of the principles that we've thought about with respect to the alliance is when you have someone join, do you want to bring in an internal conflict right into the alliance? And Georgia obviously brings that conflict right in. The second point is whether or not you could actually get support. With respect to Sweden, Finland, and I think Montenegro, there'll be support. With respect to Georgia, you probably would have an incredible split in the alliance. I think that the alliance, it's a little bit like what Winston Churchill said about the United States. It always does the right thing after it's tried everything else, right? The alliance takes a long time to get to its positions. The French, for example, were just a little while ago still selling the Mistrals or thinking about selling the Mistrals to Russia, and then they finally decided not to. I think that was the right decision. I think that we need to do a lot with Georgia, and it may well, excuse me, may well be that they should become a member, but frankly, I don't think the alliance is ready to have them be a member.
Okay, Lilia, would you like to take the other?
Yes, Andre, apparently I'm with you on the same page regarding Putin and Obama. Well, firstly, the fact that apparently, most possibly, the meeting will take place on the margins of the United Nations General Assembly will mean that blackmailing the West and blackmailing of the United States, forcing Washington to accept the Russia's trade-off on the Russia's terms, has succeeded. And it apparently will have an influence and repercussions on the Western position regarding Ukraine, and maybe some other issues as well. So it's working. It's a tactical victory of Mr. Putin. I'm not sure that Washington understands it at the moment, but it will be a Pyrrhic victory too.
Okay.
Just a couple of quick points.
Please.
Just to pick up some of the previous ones as well. First of all, I don't think under any illusion we can talk about Iran as an ally. We need to recognize actually the clear and present danger that will continue, which we've been, even as we try to manage the nuclear program. And so going down that path is I think, very risky. On the Russia and even in the space issue, I mean, our goal is not to drive Russia from the global community and break its linkages. And we actually don't want a Russian economy that can be an autocracy, that is protected from the world. Our whole premise was to welcome and allow for those linkages of integration. The problem is we've let some of those linkages begin to sap and undermine our approach, our values, and our principles, which has got it backwards. So in the specific issues, we've got to focus not on just breaking. We don't want to break connections. We want to mitigate our dependency with alternatives so that we're never overly dependent. And then I just add a word on Georgia. I think this is a tough issue of credibility for the alliance, and we're running too much of a pattern of things that the alliance has said or done, just not looking credible. And I think that's hitting at the challenge that Putin has posed. To strike at the heart of the alliance. If you can really raise questions about alliance decisions here and there, you begin to raise alliance questions about Article 5, and that's a slippery slope. I think there's a need to get this right. We won't get Georgia in NATO right until we actually have a coherent strategy for Europe's East, and one in which the United States plays a significant role, because the gap in the area is going to be security.
Okay, I think we had a few hands in the back. Yes, yours, and we will come up front again. In the green sweater there, and then we'll catch the gentleman over on the side. Yes, the green sweater, right.
Hi, my name is Michael Overton from the George Washington University. I know, Mr. Kramer, you were talking about the idea of the Russia that we want to see. Have we failed since Georgia to signal our intentions if Russia kind of doesn't meet our expectations or doesn't live up to our hopes? Have we been failing in our response to Ukraine? Do we have a lot more room to make up for in this new coming strategy that we're coming up with in Warsaw?
Okay, thank you. And if you'll pass the mic over to the end here. Yes, the gentleman here. If you'll introduce yourself.
Hi,
please.
Ira Strauss, Committee on Eastern Europe and Russia and NATO. One of those interesting things in philosophy is when there's an undefined term, strategy. And I think Lily, as a philosopher, would appreciate, I will define strategy, if I may. Strategy is the active part of a perspective. Perspective is a view of past, who we are, where we come from, where we're going to, where we should. Strategy tries to fill the gaps, unite where we are going to where we want to be going, and fulfill who we are. If that's a reasonable definition, I think we have inadequacies both in our perspective of the past, who we are. The Atlantic Alliance didn't begin in 1949, it began in 1917 with roots in the Anglo-American rapprochement, and gaps in our perspective of the future, where we want to go, how to get there. And I want to be brief, but I do want to remind you, the perspective of the Atlantic Alliance is there is an objective Atlantic unipolarity in the world. If we consolidate the Atlantic countries to a common foreign policy and strategy for the long term, this unipolarity will be manifest, countries will be attracted to it, the Atlantic will be able to expand. This dates back to the late 19th century. Theodore Achilles, the founder of this institution here, the Atlantic Council, shared that perspective. He got it from his predecessors. He developed it in the interwar years, not just in the Cold War era.
Let's see what the
for the
reaction
future,
is to
could
your
I just suggest, I'd suggest 3 gaps for the future. One, a loss of belief in the objective unipolarity. I think it's a false loss of belief, but clearly neither the right, which believes in American unilateralism, believes in Atlantic unipolarity, nor the left, which wants to be rid of Western unipolarity. Second, a lack of a sense of attraction of countries to this as a long-term evolutionary strategy, a belief that we have to impose our values without double standards everywhere, including the Middle East, which had catastrophic consequences for the long-term success of our values, and convinces people that we could be clinically insane.
What's your third?
And the third is then the prospect of attracting Russia back in this generation, not just 100 years in the future, to wish to become a part of the Western world, which it did in the late 80s and early 90s.
Let's hear their comments. Okay, so we had two questions. We have the first one, which was directed to you, Frank, and then we have the other point made. Frank, you want
Right.
to take the first one?
Sure. So, have we failed with respect to Russia and with respect to Ukraine? No, I think the people who have failed are the Russians and Ukrainians. Ukraine had it could best be described as a failure of governance internally. That's probably the polite way to put it. And the Russians chose their own course. They chose to use the words I'd used earlier, to resent the West, resent the Western values. There was nothing done to them. They put NATO on the top of their security concerns. As Lilia says, that you've got to have a sense of humor in geopolitics, and I couldn't agree more. But it was their decision to do that. In fact, in the 90s, while the West was not particularly helpful to Russia, it wasn't anti-Russia. It was the Russians who failed themselves. And if I can just say a word about the second question, I don't think we need to apologize for being in favor of what I call the liberal world order. The UN Declaration of Human Rights, 1947, and the like, sort of gets at that sense. If it was up for vote again today, it wouldn't get a lot of countries, but I think that is what we stand for. And there are a number of countries, Korea, difference between the Republic of Korea in 1953 and what it is now. It used to be an autocracy, militaristic autocracy. It's now a democracy. Obviously, Japan, which was mentioned, changed. Germany changed definitively. I think we, want that kind of change. How you bring it about, as I said, I think you have to let the people of the country bring it about, but you can create an international environment that encourages it.
We're winding down. Do you want to make a quick comment on this, both of you? Go ahead, Damon.
Two quick ones.
Go ahead.
I think the nexus between Syria and Ukraine is quite interesting in terms of failing to signal. I think in part our mishandling of Syria helped Moscow imagine that it could actually get away with what it's trying to do in Ukraine. And interestingly enough, right now what I think is playing out is that Syria, in some respects, and the Russian gambit there, is allowing Moscow to actually tamp down in Ukraine a little bit. The costs that the Russians are paying on Ukraine are real, and I think they feel that. And in many respects, I think they may have concluded that they can get what they want, a Ukraine that won't be embraced by the West, that will have a permanent frozen conflict, and are now interested in sort of tamping down in a way that they might be able to get out from some of the economic pressure. And yet, since Putin has built his legitimacy at home based on the Russian strength abroad, I think the Syria gambit now comes in to dominate that attention and fill that role and that presence and potential void at home domestically for Mr. Putin. And just the quick reaction to this, I actually think the idea of imposing values is anathema to the system that we aspire to and the system that we've helped to build. Because the power of the United States and the power of our alliance is that it has been historically a power of attraction and not one of coercion and intimidation. In that sense, quite a contrast with Mr. Putin's strategy today. And I think that's really compelling. And no matter even the challenges that Europe is facing today, in the midst of the greatest migration and refugee movement because of turmoil since World War II, they're headed to Europe. It is the power of attraction of the principles that underpin this core political community, and ones that are embraced in a UN declaration as being universal. And I think that's actually the force multiplier for our influence and power. And the idea of imposing that as part of this strategy is anathema to what it represents.
I'm going to give Lilia, you'll get the final word because we've now exceeded our time. So you get the final closing comments.
I will give only the final sentence. I would say that you folks have a powerful instrument of influence in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and the post-Soviet space, if you practice what you preach. Short enough.
Amen.
Please give them a hand.
It's a pleasure.
Yeah, likewise.
Stay a minute, because we have Barry Pavel coming up, and we're going to stay up here for a moment while he closes us.
Great. Well, just real quick, that was a great panel. I know I'm the only one between you and a networking lunch, so I will be very brief. Just a couple of thank yous and closing thoughts. First of all, a huge thanks to Minister Sarita and Secretary Hagel and a really super set of panelists for their insights and for really raising the caliber of discussion on NATO in a way that I think is extremely helpful as the community moves towards the Warsaw Summit next summer. Also, gratitude from us to our partners, the Norwegian Ministry of Defense, for the partnership we have with them on a multi-year project. We're very proud to kick off this important discussion this fall on NATO and the Warsaw Summit in Washington. We heard from this panel, from the previous panels, how the threat landscape and the challenge landscape is really unprecedented, making the next summit for NATO a really critical one. And as Minister Sarita said, even as the challenges are multiplying, 21 out of 28 NATO countries are spending less in 2014 than in 2008 on defense, a very worrying trend in light of all that you heard today, and also amplified by the political strains from the refugee crisis and other factors. Given all of this, and certainly the A2A issues, I think the Minister Sarita's point about the need for a long-term strategy to outline and frame our policy suggestions is really critical, and I think the report that Frank Kramer just released is very, very useful for advancing that agenda for helping NATO define a strategy, which was also reinforced by Fabrice Pothier on the first panel, a NATO official. So the Atlantic Council, you'll see, is embarking on a pretty ambitious program between now and the Warsaw Summit. This is today's step. You'll see many more. And that will focus on very similar issues, policies, and strategy. In fact, we're very proud to say that we are now officially part of NATO's official public diplomacy efforts with the Warsaw Summit, which will include programming here in Washington, but also key European capitals, and at the summit itself next year in Warsaw. So please stay tuned, please stay in touch as this conversation continues. And with that, my final thanks is to all of you for your excellent questions and for your continued engagement. Thanks very much.